Lisa Leclerc from UN-IFAD in Rome. She will present the findings of a new study of IFAD on inclusive global climate finance for SDG 2. And Sven Harmeling, who is the co-speaker of the Venro Working Group on Climate Change and policy advisor with CARE International. And he will present on the case of gender-responsive and participatory climate finance for just and resilient food systems. Maybe 2 or 3 words on why we are having this event, especially from the experiences from last year and ongoing with the COVID-19 pandemic. We know that the food system is under severe stress, and many more people than before will probably be in severe situations of hunger. And therefore, it is especially necessary to support smallholders in adapting to climate change, which is another stressor for production and consumption in developing countries. And so we took the opportunity to present new insights into how to support small-scale holders in these 2 difficult situations which will be ongoing. And I'm very happy that we have so many participants who are interested in the topic. And I'm looking forward to very good and insightful presentations. And I would like to give the word to Mrs. Leclerc.
Thank you, Sonia, and good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. Thank you very much for having me. So for those of you who don't know IFAD or IFAD's work in climate change, I'll just very quickly give you a little bit of a background so you know where we're coming from on this. We've been running something called the Adaptation for Smallholder Agriculture Program since 2012. It's an IFAD-owned climate fund that specifically focuses on small-scale production and small-scale farmers. We work globally across all the regions, all 5 regions, from Latin America to Asia and the Pacific. And as we've been operating this fund for some time, we have noticed that we are starting to get more of a demand for climate finance and climate support from small-scale producers in different parts of the value chain since we started this program. And so this year we launched a 3rd phase of ASAP called the Enhanced Adaptation for Smallholder Agriculture Program with increased ambition. To give you an idea of the type of scale that we're talking about, the program in 2012 was 360 million. And since then, today, the amount of climate finance under our management is actually at around 1.7 billion. And that's both a result of the increased demand that we're getting from our member countries and also the fact that there's much more climate finance circulating in the multilateral world. So I'll start my slide to give you a little bit of a context for why this study was important and why we wanted to have a little bit of a better idea of how global climate finance flows were actually flowing to small-scale production. As many of you know, in the last couple of years, after about 10 years of positive trends, food security has started to decrease again, and especially focused on, in a number of countries, primarily lower income countries, but also some upper middle income countries, and in specific pockets of the country. It's becoming more concentrated. Today, we have over 820 million people who don't have enough to eat. And amongst those, we know that women or children are disproportionately affected by the more acute forms of food insecurity. At the same time, we're seeing an increase in obesity, which is a problem just as much for health of the population. This used to be something that was happening in wealthy countries, but the actual rates and increase in obesity are accelerating dramatically also in developing countries today. We also know that climate change is one of the strong drivers for these and is affecting all pillars of food insecurity. We see it at the availability, the production level, having access, being able to either purchase or eat healthy, nutritious food, its utilization in terms of things even like post-harvest losses and how food is treated after it's produced, and the stability. Having it predictable, fair prices and predictable harvests for local nutrition and consumption. We also know that the food system contributes 19 to 20% of greenhouse gases. In many cases, this is from land conversion from land for pasture land for cattle and livestock raising, also degradation as production decreases because of poor environmental management. There's often a pressure to expand agricultural lands, chemical food fertilizers, and also a very surprising number of food that's either lost after it's produced, and this is primarily the case in developing countries, or wasted by consumers. So once food is actually purchased and it's not used, and it's rather thrown away. Small-scale production is so important to this equation because globally, the farms that are about 2 hectares or less produce about 30% of the world's food. This increases to about 90% in lower income countries. So very important to the introduction that Sonia just gave on the extreme food insecurity that we're seeing in developing countries and how important small-scale production is there. We also know that women comprise about 50% of employment in the agriculture sector in low-income countries. And that's significant, and this is often in production, but also in post-production processes. Yet they have only access to about 15% of land as landholders. They face equal barriers when it comes to accessing finance and technology as to land. And I would say this is the same for youth as well. We're seeing that rural farms are increasingly feminized, so headed by rural women, but that also because of an exodus of young people from rural areas and from the agriculture sector, an aging of the population is taking place, which is important in terms of labor and lost labor. So what did we find when we looked at the global climate finance flows? And this is a study we did with the Climate Policy Initiative, who, for those of you who work in climate finance, know that they produce a very important report on tracking global climate finance flows. And we found that only 10 billion per year in 2017 and 2018 was going towards this sector. Now, it might seem like a lot, but the actual figure in percentage term is 1.7% of global climate finance flows, which is astronomically low when you consider the scale of the problem and the importance of small-scale production towards food security. It is largely represented by international finance flows, these numbers that have been tracked, and climate finance for small-scale agriculture is about 95% from the public sector, from the figures that we have. Most of this financing is through grants, which accounts for about 50% of the finance that's committed. Next is 33% for concessional debt, so very low interest loans or no interest loans, and non-concessional debt, which is 16%. Basically loans at fairly close to market rates. Nearly half of the tracked agriculture climate finance flows was for climate change adaptation, while 30% was for activities that have both mitigation and adaptation objectives, and the remainder for projects that only work on climate change mitigation. Low greenhouse gas emission and climate resilient infrastructure receive the largest share, that's about 36%, followed by investments to improve agriculture production at farm level, so the production area, 14%, and general measures to reinforce rural communities that are part of the food systems, and that's about 14%. 41% of the global climate finance flows are targeting rural communities in general. So these are more types of activities that seek to address poverty in a general way, but that have a very direct impact on the food system because of how these communities participate in food production. and finance that are benefiting individual small-scale producers and cooperatives are only 31% of the total. So to give you a little bit of a visualization, I'm quite a visual person, and it speaks to me when I see this in figures. The slide, the graphic on the left, the 569, that's 569 billion. So in 2017 and 2018, this is the total global climate finance flows, and it passed the $500 billion mark for the first time in 2017, 2018. All the way at the bottom right side, the two little or 1.5 boxes of green is the part that we're talking about going towards small scale agricultural production globally. So you can see graphically how small that is. The slide on the right zooms into those 1.5 boxes, the close to 10 billion, and shows that most of that investment within the 10 million is in general tagged for agriculture, forest, land use, natural resource management. Second, it's 711 million is towards renewable energy generation. Next in line is towards sustainable transport, and then water and wastewater management, and then other, these sort of more broad general poverty reduction measures. So the sources of climate finance, where they come from, almost all of the tracked global climate finance, 95%, are provided by the public sector. This is largely driven by government donors, and then the multilateral development finance institutions such as IFADs, and then bilateral development financial institutions. 95% of committed resources recorded for small-scale agriculture production are from international flows. So there's actually very little data on domestic and interregional flows. It may be higher than we know, but this is not information that is known. The majority of private sector climate finance is untracked, as well as its domestic sources of finance. The financial instruments, as I mentioned earlier, grants are the primary type of financial instruments that are used, followed by concessional or low-cost debt. And 80% of grants were provided by government donors. And then finally, low-cost project debt, so the low-interest debt, was primarily issued by multilateral and bilateral development finance institutions. The annual financial commitment type by use, as you see in the graphic on the left, about 49% of it was for climate change adaptation, 29% for adaptation and mitigation. So these are often things for us like agroforestry initiatives or soil conservation, restoration, reforestation, those types of things that have both adaptation and mitigation benefits. For small-scale production and rural producers, I would say that the mitigation part, the 22% that only has a mitigation objective, is probably the least, and that comes in often in the form of things like renewable energy for irrigation or solar pumps, food drying, those types of things. The activities that are financed within these, 36% goes towards, and the largest share, towards low carbon and climate resilient infrastructure. And I would say that this is not necessarily because it's the most important, but infrastructure types of projects simply tend to cost more, and they're more easily monetized and therefore easily tracked. Next, improved agricultural production, livelihood and livelihood of rural communities. So things like income diversification for rural farmers, and so they have alternative sources of income when they have crop failure. Technical assistance for governments. This is often in the form of things like climate information services and extension services to farmers. Capacity building for target groups, often in the form of things like forming and building capacity for women's cooperatives for sustainable agricultural practices. Improved supply chain, things like drought-tolerant seeds. Research and development, working with local research institutions and universities to provide institutional capacity to support farmers. A very small area where it's unknown, it's basically very difficult to identify what the financing is for. And finally, improved access to finance, working with things like local agricultural banks to provide innovative financial tools and instruments for local populations and farmers. The distribution geographically, you can see from left to right that most of the financing goes towards sub-Saharan Africa, East Asia, South Asia, trans-regional, Latin America, Central Asia, and the Middle East receiving the least. So in conclusion, I think it's obvious 1.7% of these climate finance flows is too low. And while we're not proposing that there are more resources going towards this area from within the climate finance envelope, we know that it's not enough, that the increases that are put forward are directed towards more inclusive climate finance flows and directed towards addressing rural poverty and food security. A higher proportion of the finance should be directed, in our view, towards small-scale agriculture, given the poor progress that is being made on SDG 1 and 2 right now. Public funding is limited, however. It will always be limited. It has a specific role to play. And therefore, we also think that it's important that it be used efficiently to also leverage higher investments from the private sector, both towards mitigation and adaptation development for small-scale producers. And that relevant data on the private sector and on public domestic climate finance is missing. And it's an important part of the puzzle in terms of being more strategic in planning, financing, and global cooperation and national planning in the future. Finally, or second to last, climate finance towards small-scale agriculture at large. It needs to increase collaboration between public and private sectors, and the way that this can be done is for public resources to mitigate the risk associated with investment in the agriculture sector. There's a high perceived risk by the private sector in engaging in this area to leverage financial resources more broadly. Government should make more effective use of public resources and policies by targeting risk management and capacity building for climate-related finance and incentivizing conservation efforts at local level. And then finally, international and domestic climate flows should stimulate the transition of agribusinesses and the financial services provided towards low-emission supply chains. And finally, to promote better information on measuring progress and transparency in global climate finance, we suggest building consistent tools to report and track international climate finance flows towards small-scale agriculture, by increasing dialogue to build common approaches and training amongst the key actors, and for private sector actors to step up in collecting and sharing this type of primary data and information on investment opportunities, which we think also helps attract and direct more of this climate finance towards climate change objectives. And recipient governments should consider tracking progress through domestic climate finance. We know that this is a challenge and it's an issue, but domestic budgets are extremely important in addressing small-scale agriculture and targets that governments have set towards increasing their domestic spending in the agriculture sector. And that will bring me to the end with a link to the report for those of you who are interested. And I'm happy to take any questions as you wish and when you want, and any clarifications that you may be looking for. Thank you very much. Over from me.
Thank you very much, Lisa, for the very detailed overview of the structure of climate finance for small-scale farmers, and of course for the recommendations to enhance these financial flows. I would suggest to move on to our next input from Sven, and after that have a discussion and Q&As on both presentations. Sven.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, I'm happy to present here some of our experience and reflections, both of course from care-specific work in developing countries, as well as how we address those issues more widely in the general space. That's why I also will include a bit of a dimension of German climate finance and climate policies and how we influence it. But let me start off with a few aspects on what, in our view, is basically good practice in terms of smallholder climate resilience. And of course, CARE is also very much determined and putting a lot of efforts in our work into promoting gender equality, which will feature in my input as well. So what I'm starting off with is here basically our CARE map, so to say. I mean, the different countries you see in color here are basically the countries where CARE International, through the country offices, through also independent members in the South, has operations. And the countries marked here in orange are basically the top 10 countries in terms of the number of people directly impacted in the context of food security and climate change work from our data systems. This has been from financial year 2018, so it's not the most recent data we have, but the most recent that's been illustrated in that way. And this is just to give you a bit of a understanding of where some of the key countries we are contributing and intervening in the context of food security and climate change. And some of the projects have a stronger food security component. Some of them are more directly around climate resilience and adaptation. But of course, as we've already seen in the first input, there's a lot of intersections between those. And there's sometimes, of course, large countries like India and Bangladesh, where sometimes we are able to have larger programs with many partners under implementation. That did explain some of the numbers. But I think what is easy to see is that some of those countries are also known to be quite vulnerable and affected by the climate crisis in terms of food security, of agricultural production, whether it's through storms, whether it's through droughts, recurring droughts, and so on. And of course, some of these here, like Yemen, is a particular case where I would say not the climate angle or the climate perspective is dominant, but of course the civil war situation. Yeah, I think we've seen in many cases how these issues around resource scarcity then also, yeah, I mean, link with each other. Just to give you a few examples of some of the ways we're working in that context. And there's one project around agro-climate information services with a particular target group of women and ethnic minority farmers in Southeast Asia, for example, in Laos and Vietnam, which aims to strengthen the value chain through a two-pronged approach. Basically, on the one hand, supplying weather forecast information in a way that they better meet the user's demand. So it's not just abstract weather data, but we've been, over many years developing approaches where it's really about understanding what kind of data at what points in time is basically what farmers on the ground, so to say, need. But then also translating the information into agro advisory services by integrating local knowledge, for example, ensure feedback mechanisms, which then lead to adaptive learning. So really also work with the farmers to understand what can be done about the challenges based on the data use. Another project, which is called the Nepal Samatya project, promotes inclusive governance and resilience for the right to food, which basically has identified, piloted, and also scaled a number of models which will help reduce vulnerabilities and increase adaptive capacity in relation to climate change with visible benefits. So it's small scale, marginalized and women farmers can adopt those practices with minimal external inputs and also help to promote them with local governments for subsequent implementation. I think it's something which we're increasingly seeing in many projects, collaboration with local governments, sometimes in the form of, providing inputs into local adaptation plans, for example, but also as conveners and bringing local governments with, for example, national meteorological organizations and farmer associations together to really also make the link about the participatory and proactive use also of climate information. And then also we, of course, with many partners are actively involved in knowledge sharing, and I'm mentioning here a kind of event or an initiative which was called Alpha 2020 in the Sahel, which acted as a large knowledge platform providing exchange between different types of users, practitioners around how to reduce vulnerability and conflict for rural and mobile communities engaged in pastoralism, agropastoralism, farming, fishing, and other livelihoods across the Sahel. But that's just a few examples. Based on multiple project experience, CARE has also been actively engaging in trying to identify what is, in our experience, let's say, key parameters for good practice for successful implementation of projects, but very much starting also from the understanding that in the climate space and in the confronting the challenge of the climate crisis, there are differential vulnerabilities between men and women. I'm picking up basically here on a joint report that IFAD and CARE did, I think it was in 2019, basically a how-to-do note around gender transformative agriculture, and where we basically identified 5 main areas for this differential vulnerabilities. One is which is the inequality in the asset base. I mean, in terms of available resources in particular, where in many countries, of course, it's often men who have the access and let's say decision-making over resources, whether that's on the household level or also on government level. And of course, this also determines to some extent the ability to be proactive, innovative, and take risks. There's often an exclusion and lack of voice, particularly from ethnic minorities, younger generations, or poor, uneducated women lacking a voice in decision-making around land use, development planning, disaster risk reduction, a lack of access to information, and differential access and training, often due to low literacy levels, but also sometimes in the way that the information is made available. And this also makes a link to something I said earlier, that really working around how can early warning systems, how can climate information systems be set up and operationalized in a way that they really serve those target groups, is one of our important areas of work. There's also often a differential exposure and sensitivity to climatic hazards, which depends on the types of crops farmed, livelihoods activities, and other factors. And then also social changes due to climatic shifts, climate impacts, including transitions in and out of livelihoods, different forms of displacement, migration, changes in labor division, and many of these have gender dimensions. And of course, without understanding these, we can be successful in basically developing the right approaches or successful approaches. So with this slide, I just wanted to show a few of the parameters, I think, which in our experience are very important in terms of good practice in different areas of, let's say, tackling climate change and undertaking adaptation. I'm not going through all of these, but you see the different areas in terms of risk and vulnerability analyses, which is an important starting point. If you don't understand the local risks in a community or in a region, and also work with the people, make them, well, not only make them understand, but provide them with the ability to have their own analysis of that, and from that then also draw conclusions. What are the capacities they have they can use, where there's need for support of whatever type. That's a very important starting point. I already talked about climate information and uncertainty. And there are a number of other aspects, of course, institutional linkages, learning, capacity building, knowledge management, and others. I'm jumping a little bit, but I think it's important to make this link as well, because we're also speaking here a bit from the German development and climate finance context. And one thing which CARE, but also a number of other organizations which are a member to FENRO are active in, is that for many years we've been tracking what German climate finance is doing, so to say. And one very interesting development in the last years has been that the official evaluation institution of the German Development Corporation recently published a report which did a portfolio analysis of Germany's adaptation finance. And we've looked into this a bit with a few organizations, and there's also an article published here, and I'm just highlighting a few of the weaknesses. They are not agriculture specific necessarily, but I think we see a number of challenges here which are across the adaptation space, including in agriculture. There's a lack of a systematic adaptation strategy for German climate finance. We also see an increase, well, we need an increase instead of a stagnation of adaptation finance to civil society organizations. There's been a stagnation over the last years, while we think, of course, the support to civil society organizations is also an opportunity to increase support to small-scale farmers in different ways. We're also seeing a relatively strong overcoding of bilateral adaptation finance. I mean, Lisa looked into a lot of the climate finance issues. This is another dimension where you can have seminars of days and weeks and can get lost in Excel sheets and analyzing various data. But I want to highlight very briefly here that we've also in other studies identified as a society that there's challenges of overcoding. There's also a lack of gender integration, for example, which you can derive from the data, and where Germany has to step up. There are countries which are, I think, even worse in that regard, but it's something which needs to be also performed and pursued more actively, and that will also help the common cause we're talking about here. In terms of our main federal positions on climate finance, I think Lisa also said, I mean, particularly in the smallholder adaptation finance support, but also more broadly, in our view, there's still a significant need for increasing adaptation finance, even if we, and that's important, if we also have to talk about quality and what are the approaches to promote. And we're not saying that everything that Germany finances is great. But within that debate, we are working towards German government to make new announcements to further increase climate finance from current levels, roughly 4 billion to 8 billion euro by 2025, and that's an established federal position. Also to increase the share of adaptation finance in overall climate finance to 50%. There have been some good developments in German finance in the last years, but we're still not there. Just touching on it very briefly, but it's also very important for the context of food security and impact on food supply and the situation of farmers, is loss and damage finance, which is a bit more about what financial support is available to deal with and partially compensate some of the losses that people in developing countries are experiencing. It's a bit a hot and toxic issues to some extent, but it's something which we as society don't want to let it fall off the agenda. We also still think there's a stronger need for prioritizing the most vulnerable countries, in particular LDCs and island states, as well as, and I've mentioned this a bit before, finding ways to better prioritize very vulnerable groups. Also, the promotion of ecologically and socially sound pro-poor smallholder agriculture measures and adaptation finance can be strengthened, although I need to say I don't think we have a current comparable analysis specifically for German finance like Lisa showed more widely, but I think that could be interesting to look into. As I mentioned already, that we're also pushing for and promoting a better and more systemic integration and promotion of gender equality in adaptation finance, and also advocating for increased support for multilateral climate funds. I think one needs to say that, of course, also the multilateral funds have their own challenges in terms of speed, of governance, of let's say politics. But I think it's also interesting to see and to remind us of that one of the advantages of these funds is Adaptation Fund, Green Climate Fund. We have a much higher level of transparency. I mean, you can really dive into the project proposals that are financed. You can understand a lot of what kind of measures, also in the context here of smallholder agriculture, are going to be implemented, which institutions take up which roles. And as civil society, and CARE is only one of many players here, we are tracking the GCF within Germany. We have regular dialogues with the BMZ and the BMUs and ministries around the Green Climate Fund with a couple of NGOs. And these funds have also, I think, seen quite significant learning curves over the last years in terms of developing gender policies. For example, in the GCF, all projects now have to have a gender action and social inclusion plan. And of course, while many projects are still in the initial stages of implementation, I hope that we will see in a few years that this also pays off for really improving the situation of smallholder farmers in terms of being better able to adapt and increase the climate resilience. So I want to close here and thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to the further discussion and questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sven, for this very interesting and important overview of the recommendations to improve climate finance, especially with a gender perspective. So I would like to open the floor to the discussion and the Q&A.
Is it allowed to ask a question to my co-panelist?
Yes, sure.
I was just curious, of course, the point that you made about an overcoding was one that sort of caught my interest, especially because my presentation had been quite a bit on the coding of climate finance. Could you explain a little bit more what you mean by it and why you think it's a problem, sort of the overcoding? If you could just maybe dig into that one a little bit more, I'd be very interested to know more.
Yeah, okay, no, and hopefully it's also interesting for the rest. But I mean, the OECD basically applies this marker system where more or less all development finance projects are marked, whether they have whether a certain issue is a primary objective, that's marker 2, whether it's a significant objective, that's marker 2, or whether a certain issue is not at all an objective of a certain program. And this marker system both exists for climate, for mitigation and adaptation, but also for gender equality, for example. And just to mention, we've also put out a study some years ago, and I'm working on an update which cross-references the adaptation marker and the gender equality marker. And this marking system of OECD is an important basis for the climate finance that developed countries also report into the UNFCCC as their official finance. It's not the same, it's the basis. And we've found many situations where a certain project was, for example, marked as climate marker 2, for example, adaptation marker, and which then is counted to a large extent or even 100% as adaptation finance. But there are different types of cases. There are sometimes cases, for example, we found this for, in particular, Japanese climate finance in a recent study, but where, for example, bridges over a river are then labeled, this is adaptation finance because they're sea level rise and so on. And technically what would be appropriate is to only count the additional costs you have because of climate change as adaptation finance, and it's not a full 700 million bridge project, for example. And this basically balloons, so to say, the adaptation finance that is reported by developed countries. And we did very specific studies as NGOs for German climate finance, but also some others. And sometimes you find cases where the finance is over-reported, at least in our perspective, sometimes by, let's say, 2/3. So that means 2/3 of what is labeled climate finance is not appropriate to label it. And to conclude, I think the consequence of this, of course, that much more finance would actually have to be made available to just get to the reported level and to what developed countries claim they are providing. So the gap in climate finance is even bigger than it often appears from the official numbers.
Thank you, Sven. I don't see any other questions, so I would just take the liberty to pose one myself to Lisa and to Sven. Lisa, your report recommends a stronger role for the private sector because there's a need for more and intense climate projects, and finance should be leveraged. So my question is, do you already have experiences with leveraging and blending in the climate finance for smallholder sector? And if yes, what are they? I'm asking because in other projects where blending is used, the long-term developmental impacts are not very clear. So especially in this very important area where people depend with their livelihood and nourishment on the finance and the adaptation measures, it would be very important that the developmental impact is rather large. So my question is, do you have experiences and how do you adapt? And to Sven, have you any insight from the civil society perspective, especially from your projects or project partners in this regard?
Maybe let me start off with a political perspective on this blending issue. And I think overall I can say as a society, we are not necessarily against involving private sector. So but I think what is an important starting point is that you have to look at the country context, and it's not primarily about bringing in the private sector from Germany to do a project somewhere else, but figure out, okay, what are the capacities of the private sector locally as a starting point. And of course, sometimes it's not really clear what we mean when we talk about private sector. Is it big companies? Is it every small business that's out there? That's another issue, but I see it in the climate finance space. There's often a lot of push from developed countries towards, as long as we involve the private sector, everything is fine. I say it a bit blunt, but so the starting point has to be what's needed in a project or what's needed in a community and regional context in terms of exactly what you said, addressing the long-term development needs. And then there might be a useful contribution from the private sector. There might be contributions, let's say, for example, through insurance expertise that can come from the private sector, through other types of financial mechanisms. But yeah, I think I'm not aware at the moment of well, there are some projects that we as carers are implementing where we, for example, cooperate with local banks or local finance service deliveries in, for example, providing access to finance for agricultural measures. I don't have specific detail at this stage, but what I think is important is that the starting point must be the situation in the country or in the region you want to improve, and not at all costs we need to bring in private sector. And also that's also an issue in the climate finance space in terms of accounting. That we're also quite skeptical to what extent you account then some private finance contribution as climate finance. Maybe just a few responses from my end.
Maybe I can follow up on that on sort of I think the scope of what we mean in small scale agriculture of private sector includes small scale farmers themselves. Right? Because when you think about what they do, some of it is subsistence farming. They're producing food for consumption. Most of them it's mixed. Some of them it's all for sale. So these are people who have businesses in producing food that they sell to markets. And it's small and medium-sized enterprises that benefit from having access to things like innovating, adapting, trying to new techniques, especially in the context of climate change where it's necessary. So I think some of the ways that we do that and where we have some success is partly working through financial institutions, agricultural finance banks, to reduce the barriers. And Sven mentioned, for example, the challenges that women have in accessing resources, capital, technology, investment. And often it's because they don't have the collateral to be able to go to a bank and take out even a zero interest loan. And the climate loans that we work with, that we provide through the agricultural banks are zero interest loans for women's groups, for example, to be able to come forward as a group and therefore have enough collateral and assets to be able to take out a small loan in order to return that investment into their business. So I think that's a very powerful way of integrating it into the financial system and using our levers to reduce the barriers so that small scale entrepreneurs have access to that. So I think that's at the smaller scale. One that's more recent, and we actually had a discussion on this yesterday, and it's new for us. It's something that we've just introduced, is by introducing these types of standards through procurement and procurement processes. And we're not a large financial institution. We're one of the smaller development financial institutions. But other organizations are doing this as well, where when you're procuring goods and services, you have things like ensuring that 50% of contractors are from marginalized populations or groups, or from women's groups, or that materials that are being sourced are from sustainably produced agricultural sources. That demand creates the supply as well. And then at the same time working then with those service providers in developing countries to be able to meet the standards that are being set. And it creates an environment of innovation and provision of goods and services that are climate friendly. So it's working, I think, somewhat with those market levers and barriers. And then the third one that I would mention is just like anybody else, most of us are very resistant to try something new when it involves our own livelihood, without some assurance that if it doesn't work, we have an alternative, we have a backup. Right? When you think of human behavior, we all behave this way. And the same thing for a small-scale farmer. They'll be hesitant to try something that seems maybe a bit strange or different that they don't have experience in without some risk coverage for them. So that's, I think, also where public sector funds can come in and have a role and assume some of this risk for small businesses, for medium-sized enterprises, to be able to test new technologies, gain the experience, and then demonstrate that there is also an economic benefit and return from those new technologies and new techniques, that they're more likely to pick up and scale up. So those are sort of three ways I think that we work with the market system to create the conditions for more private sector innovation.
Thank you for clearing that up. Very interesting, and I'm looking forward to more input on that. And I have one question.
Thank you for your question. I think it's a very good point, and I agree with you that I think it's a mix of demand and supply. I think you're right that often those who are most marginalized are not able to communicate also their needs and their demand. And we're very careful about, we have something called a targeting policy, where there's an analysis done at the global and at the local level to really identify those portions of the populations that are the most marginalized. There's limitations to that, of course, because sometimes things like census data, population data, is not always as complete and of quality that we would like. But we work very much through farmers' organizations, civil societies organizations, rural institutions who do have their boots on the floor. I mean, we're a fund basically in IFAN, but we work through those partnerships and through the analysis of the target populations to do that segmentation that Sven was talking about as well. So we have our social inclusion priorities include women, youth, indigenous peoples, nutrition, so those who are suffering from poor nutrition, and indigenous peoples. And so we try to target the financing in that way, exactly because of the challenges that you're mentioning. I'm not saying that we're always successful, but that's the intent.
Yeah, and if I may add very briefly, I think we're also now in a situation where most of the adaptation projects in the agricultural sector, so to say, and with some smallholder relevance, at least in my perspective, they are not abstract projects that only talk about adaptation benefits in 10 years from now, but I think they all have components which look at the current situation and, of course, integrating the potential evolvement of climate risk. But I think today, every climate variability, so to say, we have has a climate change footprint. And so I think we're beyond the debate where in the past you only looked at adaptation as something in 10 years from now. And so all these projects have to show also to get enough political support in those countries that they deliver some more immediate benefits, I would say, and you can find them in many approaches. I'm not saying all these projects are perfect, but I think generally this is not like a split necessarily to only talk about long-term future benefits, I would say.
Thank you. I don't see any other questions, and our time, unfortunately, is already up. So I would like to ask Lisa and Sven whether they have some final remarks on the future of climate finance for small-scale farmers. So I would give the mic to Lisa and then to Sven.
I'll first maybe start by also thanking Sven for his presentation. I think the work through civil society organizations is critical, and that cooperation needs to continue. And we're very happy with the cooperation that we have with CARE to now, and I'm sure that'll continue into the future. I guess I would end by saying that if we are to meet the goals of zero poverty and zero hunger, and given that it's becoming an issue of increased inequalities as well, the climate finance flows have to take that into account. And we can't achieve the Paris Agreement without achieving the SDG goals, and vice versa. They really go hand in hand. And I think that the space that we're in now is really focusing in on these growing inequalities to halt it. So that is my hope for the future, that the climate finance will leave no one behind. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much, and I totally concur with that hope for the future. And I think also the analysis that you presented, I think it's very important to have this zooming in, so to say, on issues around smallholder agriculture and how they are reflected in climate finance, both to understand the lack of action there or the lack of sufficient focus, but by that also highlighting some of the, let's say, good practice that's out there, some of the improvements that need to be made. And I think we still need to see, in particular, if you look at multilateral climate funds, but even in bilateral to some extent, there's still certain institutions which are particularly influential through their role as implementing agencies, for example, as the ones who work with governments to promote projects or prepare projects for those funds. We for many years, I think we've been complaining, and probably still do so, that there's often insufficient access and involvement of society and local communities, and sometimes lack of transparency around that. So I think that's something we still need to advocate for. But I think it's also there's more possibilities today from learning from good practice and better understanding of how to deal with those challenges in the context of an unfolding climate crisis than in the past. And I think we need to also give prominence and also voice to those actions on the ground, as well as more broadly effective projects. I think it's some of my final words.
So thank you so much for your presentations. And I think everybody in the call totally supports your vision of the future to enhance and to improve climate finance for smallholders, and so that no one else ever will be left behind. So thank you so much. And I hope we will see each other again. Venro will work on climate finance and on food security in the future too. And we are very much looking forward to having another discussion, maybe later this year or in the next year, on this issue, to follow up on what has been going on or has been improved with regard to this issue. So thank you so much. Have a good day and a lovely weekend, and see you soon.